I'm Indy Nidell, and this is a Great War live stream special. Now, I'm here with one of our best friends, Othais from the YouTube channel C&Rsenal. Othais, can you say hi to everybody for a sec?
Hello, everybody.
Everybody. Now, this episode is going to be very popular with people because the last collaboration that we did together, we talked about some of the rarer weapons of the First World War. And today we're going to be talking about the British handguns and rifles of the First World War, yes?
Yes, we are.
Well, why don't I just turn it over to you and you can jump right in since you're going to be doing most of the talking and me and Flo are going to be asking questions and things like that. Okay?
Absolutely. So before we go any further, I want to just clarify one thing. We're going to talk about some of the main recognizable weapons of Britain because as with any of these larger powers, they brought in a lot of extra equipment. If you want fine detail, you can check out C&Rsenal because we are breaking down every little thing. But for today, this is just an overview. It's got to kind of fit in a reasonable amount of time once it's edited. So we're going to hit the highlights, and I hope I have some things that you guys care a lot about. So traditionally, I think have we done the pistols first, Indy? Is that what we've been doing?
Pardon? What'd you say? Have we done the pistols first? I think we've mixed it up a little. Hang on, Flo asked me to say something. What? Oh yeah, in case you're wondering, the link to his channel is below in our description. And so you'll get all the detail there. This is a nice general overview. I think the first few, we started with the rifles first. I don't mind which one you want to start with first. Just jump in where you feel most comfortable.
I think we'll work small to big and give people something to get excited about, huh?
Yeah.
So for handguns, when we talk about Britain, their standard cartridge is going to be 4.55. As a matter of fact, I have some examples here to show you. So let's just talk about cartridges first. Britain had done like the United States and gotten interested in having what was called a man-stopper cartridge. So just if you guys can see this, and I know for live it's going to be a little zoomed out, but we've got 45 ACP, and then on the far side we have our British 4.55. This is not original ammo. This is a reload, modern reload. This is a modern reload as well. This is actually World War II. So they have a somewhat less powerful but still equally fat cartridge as the US 45 ACP, and they're really obsessed with having a sort of large bore handgun that harkens back to the black powder era and is used for sort of knocking down opponents. Now, when they move over to a semi-automatic handgun, as we're going to see in a moment, they'll keep that same diameter, give it a little more oomph, and go to a semi-rimmed pattern just so that you can see that ammo. And for comparison, that's 9mm. So these are hefty little pistol cartridges.
Right. Cool.
Now, let me get these out of the way. And I'll bring out our first piece. We're going to skip down the Webley heritage. This is the Webley top break revolver Mark V. If we zoom in on this one, we can get a better look. Now, first things first, I will say this one has been converted later on for import sales in America. What they did is they shaved the back of the cylinder so that they could fit the 45 ACP cartridge in it. I would not recommend firing standard commercial 45 ACP out of one of these guys, though, because they are rated for a milder 4.55 Webley. But these handguns are basically cousins to the US Schofield with some significant improvements. They're double single action with a lever top brake, so you press and release. When you release, you're going to simultaneously eject all of your cartridges. Later on in the war, you would see things like fast loaders like the Prideaux loader. Those really weren't as prevalent as people would wish they were. Generally, you were stuck single loading, but at least you got to kick everything out at once. Significant improvement over some of the revolvers we've seen so far. Now, in this gun, again, we've explained this before, but double single means that I can either manually cock the hammer and then pull the trigger to drop it, or I can pull the trigger all the way through and just fire the next cylinder.
Right.
Now, these guys, with the Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV, Mark V, you see little improvements, strengthening of the action, widening of the cylinder, that sort of thing. We're going to work up a whole episode on what makes this different from an earlier model. But for the most part, from the Mark II to the Mark V, you're seeing this sort of medium to long barrel and this sort of bird's beak grip, this nice round shape. This is good for drawing. A lot of people were comfortable with this grip back in the day, especially for single-handed shooting. But when we get into the war, you're going to see this gun get a little bit of an upgrade. So this would have been standard issue as the war started. It doesn't mean that there were a ton of them, though, because just as it was being introduced, you have the war kickoff very shortly after. There's already a lot of the older models laying around who look almost identical to this, except for slight differences in.
Wait, which mark is that one? Which mark is that one?
This one is the Mark V.
Mark V. And so they were using the Mark V around when the war broke out already. I mean, they had.
Yeah, the Mark V was adopted basically the year before the war broke out. Now, the Mark IV looks identical. It just has a slightly narrower cylinder. It's these little incremental improvements, incremental improvements that you see in the British system so that it advances the Mark system. But basically, pre-war Webleys are going to look like this for the most part. That's not a hard rule. And there's a wide variety of where these were issued to police forces and different units with different slight changes to them. So don't sweat the details. What would happen, though, during the war is that they would swap this out for the Mark VI, which actually harkens back to the earlier Mark I in that we have this much larger sort of elbow-shaped with a wide bell grip Mark VI revolver. Now, this is less convenient to carry, but if we take a closer look, we get a much larger barrel. We have a much more pronounced grip. This thing is designed for actually target shooting. And I don't mean casual target shooting. I mean aiming and firing more consistently. And to be fair, you have to understand this is a strong decision because obviously this takes up a little bit more metal per gun. They felt like they needed this upgrade. Now, one disadvantage of this gun is that working from a large caliber like .455, the gun itself is very large and awkward, and then there's a tendency in training to anticipate the recoil and other problems like that. The British, after the war, would move away and go to a .38 caliber revolver for ease of training. So these are not the simplest pistols of the war. They're heavy hitting, they're 6-shot, they're certainly reliable. But, you know, if you're sitting at this and going, yeah, I deeply prefer this over a 7-shot 32 ACP, well, you might if you took the time to practice. If you hadn't taken that time, though, the 32 ACP might be a little bit easier for you to use right out the gate with less training.
When did the Mark I actually come out? I mean, how old was this whole Webley series?
So there's an interesting exchange of Webley ideas. Webley did the Webley company, as it was, and it's changed names. It's been Webley Scott after some partnerships and stuff, but turning the clock back, Webley did a really good job of collaborating with other inventors. So you see things like Webley Greens and Webley Prize and stuff like that. This particular gun builds on other concepts already present in Webley, other concepts in other guns, but it turns up for British service about 1886, but it's not officially adopted until some years later. That doesn't mean they weren't already in inventory right away. So this is a right at the tail end of the black powder age revolver that has then made it into the smokeless era pretty significantly. Like, you don't see this getting replaced until the 20s.
Wow. That's pretty heavy. Cool.
All right, sorry, I had an internal note. No, we don't. It's fine. We take it off the cameras, and they're still running, and I'm still... Okay, good. So let me pick up where I was. Now, these guys, both of them combined, are definitely icons of the First World War. I don't know that anybody doesn't recognize them at this point if you're familiar with British equipment at all. And like I said, this is a very shallow perspective on these guns. They deserve a lot better, and we will be giving them a full rundown with accessories and other things. I know a lot of people are probably wondering why I don't have a Pritchard bayonet on this, because that's one of the most infamous things with the Mark VI, is that commercially made bayonet that you could get for the end of it. Those did not appear until, I believe, 1916, maybe early 1917. And realistically, you didn't see them widely dispersed. Not a lot of people were taking the time to put a bolt-on bayonet onto their revolver and then somehow find a way to carry it that way or quickly attach it. Like, it captivates the imagination. I doubt it was a regular occurrence. Okay. And the originals are quite rare and small in number. The reproductions, however, are incredibly numerous because it is such an icon. But again, that's something that we'll get into more detail in our own episode when we get the time. Unfortunately, this is not one we've covered just yet as of the time that this airs.
Hey, can I say one thing, Othais, that Flo wants me to say? For some reason, the chat is disabled. If you want to ask questions, ask them in the comments on Twitter or on Facebook, and Flo will see them, right?
Yeah, so we can answer them later.
I'm glad that we didn't interrupt too much, and you just handed me that, so we did that without anybody breaking the flow or anything like that. Oh, breaking the flow. See what I did? So, sorry, Othais. Back to you, man.
Who's trying to break flow?
Pardon?
I said you're trying to break flow?
No one can break.
No one can break flow.
All right, so now Britain wasn't married specifically to the revolver, although we will see, for those of you who are sort of firearms history buffs, that they're going to stay with the revolver all the way through World War II for the most part. That doesn't mean they didn't experiment with other things, though. So one of the most interesting things that's going to come out of Britain just before the war is this, the Webley self-loading pistol. This particular one is a Mark I naval. They would also have one for the horse artillery. That one's much more rare, much harder to get a hold of, but that has an adjustable rear sight, and it could take a shoulder stock. We're going to stick with the one that we were able to get and take a closer look. So with this guy, it's a semi-automatic pistol. It feeds from a very large boxy magazine so that it can work through. And this is a hand reload of ours. It took some work to get these set up so that we could shoot this gun, but we have now. The episode is forthcoming. But that is a large cartridge and a large single stack magazine in order to handle it. And somewhat interestingly, while we're talking about this magazine, is that it has, requested by the Navy, mind you, 2 positions so that if you secure it on the first click, it becomes a single loading gun. And after every time you fire, she'll lock open, and then you can toss another loose round in there and close her and shoot again. So presumably this is for safety on the target range or some other weird form of convenience that we're not familiar with anymore today. But for me, honestly, when I was playing with it, I found it just to be sort of troublesome because you had to make very sure that you drove that all the way into the actual firing position. The magazine release, by the way, is on the bottom and is a push button. The thing has a grip safety, so you have to grip the gun in order to then pull the trigger and drop the hammer. This gun is very interesting in that it uses a sort of top shelf lock system, which means the bearing surface for the lock just is on the top of the slide. This system, for those of you who are familiar with modern handguns, is very popular now today, which is that you just have the barrel move up and down, and then the barrel / chamber area locks into the slide, and that's where you get your locking surface. It's extremely simple because it doesn't add any additional locking components. That part of this gun still carries on today. The rest of this, however, as you can tell, is just grossly over proportioned. I mean, I have large hands as it is for, comparison to World War I, but this is a big gun. This almost outweighs a 1911, and in some proportions is definitely bigger. And again, still as big as all this is, it's still just a single stack pistol. Right. Now, these things were not super common in the war. You're looking at 7,000-8,000 for the most part right from the get-go. Now, these would be issued mostly in terms of what we're looking at in possible combat or usage in battle. You're going to look at things like naval marines. You're going to look at things like naval pilots. And then the horse artillery, like I said, had their own version that was it's almost completely parallel to that Luger LP08 that we've talked about before, because it was meant for the artillery, and then it kept getting snatched by pilots because they really liked that particular gun with the detachable stock, and they would even go so far as to make a 20-round magazine for the pilot's version, and that would be one of the early air pistols of the war.
That's really cool. So, no, it's on me. No, I'm just, sorry, I'm just explaining to the camera that that's really cool. I mean, we talked enough about pilots and about their early tactics before we really started working with the machine guns, so that's good to know.
Yeah, and by the way, this gun and the revolvers, they're all pushing that large bore, slow-moving cartridge. So it's a heavy hitter, but trying to adapt it for something like, air-to-air combat, I doubt there were many easy strikes with something like this. I mean, it would have to catch up to the plane first. With those out of the way, I just want to mention a couple without going into too much detail, because there's more room to talk about these things in other episodes. Like this shouldn't be considered core to just Great Britain. So one thing Britain did is that they would buy from the US. So you have things like the New Century, which is essentially the same as the Smith & Wesson 1917 revolver. This is all Smith & Wesson's large frame military style revolver. Here, let me get this closer in. And again, for those of you who are familiar with US stuff, this just looks like a nice big, 1917 style Smith & Wesson. Well, this one is chambered in .455, and these would be purchased by, say, Canada and Britain, and these would see service in the war. However, I really rather get into detail on this particular design when we're talking about the US, because it's really centered on US design.
Right. Okay.
And then another thing that would be drawn into the war, because Britain was desperate for material, would be Spanish-made handguns.
Here we see again. We always see Spanish-made stuff.
Yeah, the arms makers to the Great War. Let me tell you, it was a boom industry for them. This particular gun is another. Well, this gun is like a Smith & Wesson #3 clone. So this is almost like a latter-day cowboy revolver that was duplicated, and because it was so compatible with large bore, it was popular for certain countries to purchase. So you're going to see things like Bulgaria is going to get some in 44 Russian. You're going to see Italy get them in 10.35 Bodeo, and you remember the Bodeo from our previous Italian episode. Same cartridge. The Italians would use this, and then the British were able to get it in 4.55. This particular example is not a British issue, but we can take a look just to get an idea of what we're dealing with. You've got a pinch and pull top brake, which is delightful, but still simultaneous eject. And generally, the workmanship was better than you would think. However, they were not made to last over, the decades. So a lot of these are in pretty rough shape today. But this is the same general pattern as any of them. This one in particular is in 44 Russian, but you could have this. Most commonly, you're going to see 44 Russian, Italian Bodeo cartridges, or British 4.55.
That's really cool. Now,
we're going to get into these separately. I would recommend at some point that we have a sit down and just talk about Spanish weapons once I've got enough of them in-house, because it's fascinating how many things were imported to which countries during the conflict.
That's what I was just about to suggest, actually, because it's funny that it seems every time we have a special, here comes Spain, Yeah,
if you're on the Entente side, you're probably buying something Spanish short of the U.S. Yeah. But again, they worked. They were kept in inventory post-war for a while. They weren't the favorite revolver by any means, but just like with the French, they were there and they went bang. And they certainly hit where you pointed, assuming that you could read these tiny little sights on this thing. So, gift horse in the mouth.
Yeah, cool. 10 points to the Spaniards.
But I think with this, we've pretty much wrapped up our pistols. And I'm trying to keep it light and easy so that this can get shortened up for a good edited show.
Sure.
But if you'd like to know any more about those pistols, by all means, give us a shout out over at C&Rsenal.
And again, you'll find links to his channel down in the description, and you should all go and subscribe. It's a really cool channel. I mean, you can't not learn something there.
All right. Did you, Indy, want to gather some questions while I let these cameras cool for just a minute?
Yeah. What do you got, Flo? Let's get them together.
Just dial a couple in, and then I can restart the cameras when you're ready. I'm just going to let them cool down while I have an opening.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. How about this one? Okay. Why didn't the British opt for a semi-automatic pistol like others did? Was it a cost decision?
Okay. Is there anything? What? Let me let them cool for a moment. So give me like 3 that I can answer.
Okay. Now let's see. Let's see. How about this one? What about the Webley Fosbury? Is one? Yeah. You got that?
Yep, I got that tucked away in my head.
Okay. And hey, do the British produce or use any shotguns during World War I?
Okay. I think I can do those 3. So let's cook them back up. Just give me the main.
Cool. There,
yep. And then
can remind me. Cool, so no big deal. So.
All right, you got it?
Recording 2.
Okay, this is pistol Q&A. So I'm still good here. I'm just making sure we don't have any equipment malfunctions. That's always the bane of our existence on this stuff.
No, I understand. Okay, pistol Q&A.
Yeah, so I've got why no semi-automatic, why no semi-automatic, Webley Fosbury, and what was the other one?
Shotgun.
Shotgun. Yeah, okay, cool. I have to act like I'm answering a question.
I know.
Okay.
Like a what?
You can ask questions on Facebook, Twitter, on the comments.
Okay. And you can ask questions in Facebook or on the comments if you want a possibility that Othais will answer one of your questions during the rest of this stream. But the chat is disabled for the stream. Yeah. Flo says the chat is disabled, and Flo knows. Yeah.
To be fair, I heard the last chat was more interesting. All right, so Britain actually did, like we had covered, consider semi-automatic pistols. And as a matter of fact, when we get over to talking about the US 1911, they would order them in that same 4.55 cartridge. So they used semi-automatic pistols. The problem is British military procurement is a complicated process, or at least it was then. I can't speak to the modern one. But if you watch our episode on, say, the Lee-Enfield, I think you'll get a taste for how this sort of thing goes through constant revision. And it's very easy in the old British system to take a currently issued piece of equipment and criticize and change it. But it's actually fairly difficult to introduce an entirely new firearm. And so with native firearm industry getting kind of starved just before the war, there's some politics and legalities that were going into that, and so you don't have a lot of native designs right in that crucial period where semi-automatic arms are exploding. And so if you don't have as many native designs to look at, you're almost not as motivated. That's another possible nail in this coffin. But the final thing about it is the British had a reasonably simple, reasonably cheap handgun. They were all settled on a cartridge that spanned, a global empire. To make any changes off of that format, and again, just to introduce this guy, they're both 4.55, but they're totally different cartridges. This is 4.55 rimmed revolver cartridge. This is 4.55 semi-rimmed pistol cartridge. They're not interchangeable at all.
Right.
So to introduce something like that, you have to take into account spreading it across the globe, and then the headache that actually produces. Especially on the eve of the war, it's way easier to just churn out more of the same versus all of a sudden you're going to have shortages and unarmed men if you try to make a big change to that market.
Especially with a war that's going to be over by Christmas anyway. I mean, if the war is only going to last 4 months, not much point introducing something brand new when you can continue with what you got.
That's actually true. By the time industry had a chance to understand how long this was going to last, they already had overwhelming demand for what they already had. And the time it took, not just to make, you got to understand, you can't just pop up a building and then pop up an assembly line. There's a lot of trial and error in that. And in order to get the talent involved to make those things, to set those things up, you have to pull them from assembly lines or inspection lines and therefore hurt your overall production. So when raw production is it, and I've tried to explain this to people before, they go, it's interesting that a handful of designs were invented during World War I, but not much else. And none of them seem to have been deployed in any significant numbers. Almost everything in the war existed before the war. And I try to tell people that the war is one of those sort of change events in the evolutionary process. You had this period of weapons diversity before the war where everybody's speculating what would be the best firearm. And then it's not that firearms were invented for the war. It's that they were all invented before the war, or at least explored before the war. And then the war killed off the worst designs and sent up the best ones. So we see things like the submachine gun as a concept rocket out of World War I. And then we see slower gate loaders completely vanish because they're just garbage during the war. Yeah. So it kills off old designs and it promotes the best of the new designs. And then honestly, it kills off a lot of new designs that just weren't going to make it. So things like this Webley self-loader, this gun did great in its naval role and aircraft role, but then when the Royal Marines got redeployed on the Western Front and they had to deal with mud, there's a lot of reports of this thing not running so well once it's given, the good earthy treatment. So you have specialized tools, but then when you try to go to mass production, specialized tools are almost impossible to keep up with and put where they belong. So now you start trending towards the generic, and the generic has to do everything. And we're right at the, we're within the first 2 decades of real strong semi-automatic technology. That's a lot to ask for from very new technology.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so our second question was, okay, hold up. British use of shotguns. Let's go with that for a second.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's one. Yeah.
The British did not really use shotguns. You may be able to find an account of 1 or 2 people bringing one to the front like you can with anything, but in terms of ordering an issue, not really. If we really dug deep, you'll probably see 2 instances that I can think of. Just like with the US, they had aerial gunnery trainers. So you're trying to teach somebody to lead something in the air. The best way to do that is sport, skeet shooting. And so you just use a shotgun to teach them some skeet. That is not a frontline weapon. There's also some, I've seen some things where early in the war, they were using, here's the thing, incendiary ammo came out during the war essentially. I mean, they knew about it, but it hadn't been worked up. And early incendiary ammo, they needed a larger bore for it to reliably ignite something. And the British wanted to burst Zeppelins. So they would look for large bore solutions to firing a big slug. So you see things like the Martini Henry dug back out specifically to shoot at a balloon, though, not really as an infantry rifle. You're going to see the same thing. You're going to see them develop slugs for over-under shotguns. And then there's at least one sketch I've seen of a plane-mounted over-under shotgun that was firing incendiary slugs. The question is, was that just an ad hoc armorer's project, or did that actually see full development? That's where you have to kind of dig in and find out that they did 5 of them, and it's not really something that you can get your hands on and really, it made very little difference in the war. So there's a little bit of that, but in terms of actual issuance, combat, whatever, no, not so much. Now, the one country that did seem to haul shotguns to war, realistically, almost no others did in any reasonable way, is going to be the U.S.
Yeah.
And we are definitely going to be talking about that as soon as possible. There's a few more pieces to put together.
Okay, that'll be great. What was the third question? The Fosbury, right?
Oh, Fosbury, yeah. The Webley Fosbury, while incredibly interesting, is a pretty weak design for World War I because most of its action is externalized, that zigzag pattern on the outside of the cylinder. And it really was just an overpriced commercial pistol. Yes, some people with some cash managed to buy them and bring them to war, but this is a gun that wasn't really even... You're not seeing wartime production of the Webley Fosbury. This is one of those guns that everybody knows about, like the Mars pistol, but really isn't a significant factor in the war. I'm putting together notes for any accounts I can find of somebody actually wielding one in the war. I mean, I'm sure they were there, but that's way down the food chain, even in C&Rsenal, because we're really trying to focus on things that either were absolutely issued for the war, or even if they didn't see large issuance, they were developed for the war. So you see a lot of commercial guns that are repurposed that are, you see like Winchester repeaters and stuff that get not used in significant numbers, but it's still interesting that they were grasping for what they could grasp for. And you don't see this panic grasp for Webley Fosburys. You don't see a sudden contract for more Webley Fosburys. So that's why we tend to try to downplay its importance despite how cool it is, because it really doesn't seem like it was on anybody's mind at that time.
Okay. Well, that was a good answer. Did you have something else that just couldn't wait, Flo, or what?
How common were failures of the Webley break action in both the early and later versions?
Wait, how common were failures in what?
The Webley break action.
How common were failures in the Webley break action
in the early and later versions?
In both the early and later versions? Did you hear that?
Yep. Well, most people will tell you that the Webley is the ultimate reliable British engineered yada yada patriotism, but there are a few issues. Being a top break revolver, it's a little weaker across the strap, although the cartridge is adapted to that. So as much as this is not the strongest action in the world, you're also not firing 45 ACP out of it, which is still mild compared to a lot of stuff that could be available. This gun is balanced for what it is. I would say, just from using these and seeing a ton of these over the years, there's one very key weakness of this gun that I have found, which is that the spring that holds... Here, as a matter of fact, let me zoom it in so you guys can see. And I'll get my C&Rsenal favorite patented plastic pokey hand. There is a spring right here that controls the latch. So when I open up the latch, that spring gets compressed, and then I let it go. This is probably the most commonly broken part in the whole thing. I've definitely seen 24 revolvers that have had this part fail, and these are common parts to have to order for replacement for this gun. And without it, by the way, the whole action is unlocked. So the gun is unusable without this single spring, and boy, does it like to snap. But in addition to that, this is a fairly complicated handgun. I don't want to open this one up. That's for our own show. But there's a lot going on in terms of the setup and lock work over in here, and a lot of it is externalized, so it's prone to getting mud and grit built up in there. It's unavoidable. The good thing, however, is that because it is absolutely externalized, it's very easy to brush it off if you get into a problem. So while you can get things worked in there and jam it, at the same time, you can also get them back out. Okay. So overall, a good service revolver, but maybe not the legend that people make it out to be.
Right. Okay. Should we move on to some of the rifles? Yeah.
I believe we can do that. Let me get just another quick cool down period while I get set up.
Okay. I'll fill Ernie.
Or do you guys need to? You guys usually take a break at some point. Do you need it now?
Ask Flo. Did you hear that? Oh, Tony says we don't need breaks. We're Germans. Apparently, I'm German now as well.
Yeah, you can say that you don't need breaks for Germans, but try finding one of you guys on the weekend.
Yeah. Well, I work on the weekends, but then again, I'm a Swede basically now. So. I'm so glad we found the Ernie mug again. I really felt lost somehow without it. Yeah. Konrad von Hotzendorf, the Ernie of the First World War. It's more like Kaiser Wilhelm was the Ernie of the First World War.
Change focus. I don't think they got it back on.
May's worried that your camera changed focus and that you're not in focus now.
Did you hear that? May's worried that we've changed focus and that I'm not in focus now. It's okay? All right, should be fine, he says.
Okay. She was worried.
YouTube.
Can you tell what job she has around here?
Yeah. Well, she's good at it. What, Flo?
You want to demonstrate our cookery while we're at the break?
And demonstrate our...
The cookery behind you?
Oh, yeah. Hey, check this out, Othais.
What, your shirt's not tucked in?
Can you see me?
I see that you're holding something. Is that a cookery?
Yeah.
Ah.
Very nice, huh?
That's
This
pretty
is
cool.
fucking lethal, man.
Are you allowed to have that?
Holding it is scary. It's brilliant. I mean, I'm so impressed that we have this here.
Is it dated?
Pardon?
Is it dated at all?
So this is a replica, yeah? Somebody made this.
Somewhere around here, I have a World War II issue one, but I don't know where I would have it at the moment. I'm covered in bayonets and stuff too that just sort of come in with this stuff. Here, yeah, I found one of these. You want me to send it back to you guys?
What you got? Oh wow, yeah.
German artillery saber, just something that wandered in.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love to do sword stuff, but they really weren't all that important to the war by that point.
We had over my fireplace when I was growing up. You know, my mom's English. My dad met her when he was at Cambridge, and he had an old gentleman's walking sword from the teens and the 20s, but he doesn't know the exact date. And it used to hang over the fireplace. And when my parents would go out, I would use it to chop crayons in half on the floor. That was what I did with Dad's walking sword. My little brother has it now. He got it when my parents got divorced. I should ask him if I can take a look at it and see if somebody can date it properly.
Get some crayons.
Yeah, it was fun, man. They just fly all over the place when you hack crayons with a sword.
Did they ever just wonder why you went through so many crayons?
No, you know, nobody ever asked. But it's the kind of thing, you know, back in the 70s, it was perfectly normal to leave a sword above the fireplace and your 5 kids when you go out to dinner. And of course, the kids are going to play with the sword. But that was the 70s, you know. I had to start using a lawnmower when I was 9.
There's a life lesson in there somewhere.
Well, I turned out okay-ish, you know. But I learned how to handle a sword, basically, you know. I didn't put anybody's eye out. I learned how to chop and get the sharp end down.
I think there's just one of those things that it's like a concession that if you're not that bright, I guess you're not going to make it anyway.
There you go. It's the 70s was a very Darwinistic era for children. We had lawn darts. You know, by 1982, lawn darts were actually not just illegal to sell. They were illegal to sell secondhand. They were illegal to sell, period, even at garage sales and things like that. Apparently, the injury toll was in the thousands and thousands, and they kept it all hushed up. But I remember playing with lawn darts. Do you know lawn darts?
Me or them? You're talking me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I know what lawn darts are.
Do you guys know what lawn darts are? They were also called jarts. It's a dart. You know what a dart looks like, except they're about this big from the table, about this high. And they have a metal spike on the other end, because what you do, and they're pointed, you know, there's a little plastic circle you put on the ground, and you give them to the kids, and you throw it up in the air, and it always comes down point first, right? And you try to get it to come down in the circle.
Yeah, you play it like horseshoes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like horseshoes, but if you just made the horseshoe into a friggin' steel tip missile.
Then you would, that is exactly, yes. If you made horseshoes into steel tip missiles.
And then you give it to children, and then they wondered why people.
Yeah, I like that they were banned from garage sales.
Oh, man. All right, I think we're ready to roll with rifles.
Okay, me and Ernie, ready to go. Let's hit it.
1 second, we gotta start the cameras up. Recording long rifles.
Okay, cool. I'll just sit here and look pretty.
I missed the era when
Boarding long rifles.
that was a fun color. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I missed the era when like 10-year-olds had like gasoline powered mini bikes and stuff like
Oh,
just
totally.
all the time.
Audio?
Yeah, it's been recording. That's gonna be the sinker.
Do you need to do a reset on it?
No, that thing will run for eternity. All right, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready to go, man. All right.
Oh, you want me to take it?
Yeah, go ahead and take it. Okay, and we're back with Othais once again. Take it away.
All right, I think we've come to that time where we need to discuss rifles. Now, I'm sure nobody is even a little bit excited to see me pick up one of these guys. This is there's a lot of people that care a lot about this gun. This is the British short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III. Now, this particular rifle is a pure Mark III, and I'll get into the details of that in just a second. But this gun came about from a longer Enfield that had been around for the Boer War, and they had sort of learned their lesson about two big problems, which one was accurizing the rifle and also getting the sights dialed in to where they're really usable, and two, the dang thing was so long and heavy that nobody liked it, infantry or cavalry. So Britain made a very good step long before the, well, not long, but, you know, a good decade before the war, Britain made the step to go to a standard short rifle. So everybody gets the same gun, and it's kind of short, it's kind of long, it's not as light and flimsy as the carbine, it's not as grossly over heavy as the long rifle, it's something in between, and it does the ticket just right. And it's pretty true. This gun is very well designed around the idea of that 303 British cartridge and getting just the right amount of performance out of it without wasting powder or having a ton of burn off like you'll see with later like number 5 carbines. This is a good system built, again, like I had said with the pistols, out of an existing system. The British really liked reusing what they already had. So we can take a closer look, and I can walk you through some of the details that you guys are going to care about. Now, this is infamously a cock-on-close action, so the cocking piece comes back and sets up our firing pin to fire as we stroke the bolt forward. That means our locking lugs are at the rear, and a lot of people say that's what gives this thing its speed, but realistically what it's doing is, compared to some of the front locking designs, it's saving us some length out of that throw. And that's what's picking us up. We don't have to pull it back as far, therefore we don't have to take as long to operate the gun. Now, there are a lot of fans of this system. I will say, as designed originally, before the inclusion of this piece up here, it made the action kind of weak and prone to torquing out to the left, like stretching out to the left, just because of repeated use. It'd be fine for a couple thousand rounds, but you guys, it's hard to argue with anybody that owns one of these things. They walk out of headspace pretty quickly, even for a rimmed cartridge, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the system's not designed for prolonged wear. Now, the good thing is, at some point, they later added the ability to load from a stripper clip. And they did that when they came into the short rifles. They did it with a Mark I rifle that's really not significant to World War I at this point, although we do have an episode with it included. Then they figured out this nice bridge. And what this does is it allows us to line up the clip and drop our cartridges in, drop our cartridges in. And at the same time, because it's been sort of riveted and welded on here, it's bound the receiver together a little bit better across the sprit bridge and added a little more rigidity. It's just a good overall solution to a problem that existed from a previous rifle that was not adapted to stripper clip technology. Now, this had been an earlier magazine repeating system, so that's why it started without the benefit of being able to strip rounds into the magazine. You had to singularly load them. And the gun, speaking of single loading, still keeps a magazine cutoff. So in this position, we can only load 1 round at a time. And then if we pop her out, we can feed from our magazine. Another older piece of technology on the old Mark III is right here with this long-range dial sight. This one's a little loose from age, but you would set this and then flip up your trusty rear aperture, and that would allow you to fire in volley. Give me a... The concept there had actually been used in great effect before on rare occasion, but in World War I, it was not the best use of ammunition, especially with the introduction of machine guns. Machine guns can accomplish the same thing much easier. That long-range dial sight becomes superfluous if it was already dubiously useful before. So we're going to see that go away. But other details to note real quick, if you pop me back in, just because we're talking about the Mark III, and obviously we're going to talk about a different gun in a moment, this gun also has a fine adjustment knob here for windage on the rear sight. That also would turn out to be not the most useful thing when you're hurried to make guns. So basically, this gun is sort of a compromise evolution of an existing design that was good, and that makes it also good. A lot of people are already getting fuming because they're going to say this is the best battle rifle of the war. I recommend you come check out our episode to see where there are a few little hiccups with this thing, most of it coming from the fact that they used a rimmed cartridge for their ammunition. Most repeating rifles and the reliable bolt actions are going to see rimless cartridges by them, because when you start to move ammo around, it doesn't have a surface to sort of catch on another cartridge.
Right. That's a good point.
We good, Indy?
Yeah, I'm good. I'll just see it looking over to Flo to see if he had anything.
So far,
Oh, okay.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no shitstorm so far. Great. So,
Don't worry, it'll come.
yeah, okay. I can't wait. Boy, oh boy. Bring it on.
Now, this gun's going to appear around 1907. Before that, the short pattern had already been around since 1903, 1902 even. It got readopted in 1903. Tricky stuff. Again, we have a whole episode. But, so this predates the war significantly, and it's already a good idea for the war. Like, in terms of being prepared, this is it, because you have one pattern to produce, one rifle cartridge to well, that's two. One rifle cartridge to produce, and overall for supply, it's simpler. Everybody's trained on the same action, and this is the most apparent action at the front. But it doesn't mean that they had enough rifles. They actually had a lag period trying to produce enough of these for the war, because they only had so many manufacturers. And it is, with all these bells and whistles, this is not an easy gun to manufacture, just on the simple fact of you've got to clip a bunch of stuff to it that isn't on other guns, little fiddly bits. So they're going to have to bring in other arms. And as part of that, they would make use, even before the war, of existing long Lee-Enfields. Now, this particular gun is an upgraded Lee-Enfield long rifle. This would have been like a Mark I or Mark II, Mark I or Mark I Star. But what they did is they simply went back and modified the magazine a little bit and included a clip bridge, just like they added to the Mark III. So if we zoom in, you can see what they've done is they've taken the old gun, which, by the way, still has its old style safety system up on the cocking piece. They've added the clip bridge so that they can make use. And by the way, at the same time, they modified the barrels and chambers and set up the rear sights. They upgraded the rear sights. They got everything set up to use that same Mark VII ammunition, so that everything that they could possibly get was fielding the same ammunition. This process was started before there was a war, and it's a good thing they did. It wasn't complete. They certainly did more of these during the war.
Yeah.
But setting that up before the war was one of those fortuitously smart decisions, because that means you then have the infrastructure in place to just keep doing it so that you can get more and more guns to the front. So for the most part, they would try to keep these in reserve, but we see them in plenty of photographs at the front. Especially, interestingly, we see them on the Ottoman fronts. Like, there are a lot of photos of these things wandering around in Gallipoli and things like that.
That's very interesting. Wow. I'll have to start looking at that a little closer to see myself, because I we've passed Gallipoli and I didn't know this stuff when we were doing it. So cool. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I spent enough time in the image archives. I started to get a feel for where stuff ended up, because it's like I always find that photo that I'm looking for in one particular front, so you could just follow where stuff just sort of got sent. But this one, by the way, if anybody's wondering, is in particularly rough shape. They are normally a little bit nicer than this. So I'm going to set this aside. Now, the Mark III, again, standard rifle, and again, we have to produce as many as possible. And as you noted, there's a lot of things like sight protectors and hand guards, and then you got the magazine cutoff and different piling swivels and dial sights. There's all these little bits and bobs that go into that gun. Well, for every one of those bits and bobs that you cut out, you save a number of hours of production time, which means another gun gets produced that day, or another 2 guns get produced that day. And so Britain would make the decision around 1916, even though, weirdly, they sealed the pattern for the things that could be ditched off the gun. They sealed it after they had already started ditching things off the gun. So you have examples that predate the orders to do it, because the manufacturers especially were like, Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. Now, that becomes the Mark III Star, so it's just the revision of the Mark III pattern. And I have one here. The big focus are basically they name 3 things. There's more little things like whether or not they have unit markings and stuff like that, but the big 3 things that get named are get rid of the long-range dial sight, get rid of the windage adjustment, and then if you want, you can get rid of the magazine cutoff. Now, because a lot of receivers were already built or set up for it, or because certain units, like naval units, requested that they keep the magazine cutoff for their own doctrine of use, or you have producers like Australia who are just like, well, we're fine, we can just keep including it. We've already got a bunch of them in a pile ready to go. The magazine cutoff tends to actually be present on a fair number of Mark III stars, even though it could just be gone. It doesn't have to be there. So if we take a look, this particular example has retained its magazine cutoff, but it doesn't have to. It could have been gone. If it had been, they would have just built up the stock higher over where that line would be in the receiver. And they have gotten rid of that fine adjustment dial here, and on the far side we've got nothing. We have no flip up aperture, we have no dial sight. All that's over here is our regular safety. So this simplified pattern is actually the one most people are familiar with because it would carry on after the war. Yes, some places would still do the magazine cutoffs, but you really don't see the dial sights or windage adjustment coming back post-war. The Mark III Star is sort of it for the Mark III series of Enfield until you start seeing things like the number 4 developed.
Okay. What? Nothing? No? Sorry, I keep looking up to Flo just for
I
direction.
collected questions, so keep on coming, or we'll do the Q&A later on.
Okay, we'll do Q&A afterwards. Okay, well, just keep it coming, and we'll do some Q&A a little bit later then. Cool?
All right.
All right.
So that makes this the ubiquitous smelly that people like to say, although short magazine Lee-Enfield's fine by me. I can spare the syllables. Again, I probably haven't said this yet because people are so familiar with it. I should probably back up just a bit. This, by the way, one of the big things that people like to quote on this gun is a 10-round magazine capacity, which is significant for the war. Definitely of the standard issued rifles, it's double almost all of them. So a good thing about having a higher capacity in World War I is that most nations found that the way their guns got jammed up was not being thrown in the mud or carried around or even, slept on top of or something. Most of the damage to these guns in the muck was done when you took the time to load them. Loading the gun was the time that garbage was introduced and problems occurred. So the one good thing is that mud resistant or not, which it is very mud resistant, but discounting that, a gun that you load less often has less instances or fewer instances of mud getting shoved into the sensitive areas.
Right.
So it's a good thing when you have a 10-round capacity because that means that you can sort of isolate yourself long enough to keep it clean to get rounds in there, and then you have 10 rounds of action so that you're not just shoving mud back into the gun.
Right. That's cool. It's very cool. And now, was this the first of the rifles of any of the countries that had a capacity that large?
Well, when you go back to the old tube loaders, you start to see capacities of 8, 9, 10. The French Lebel obviously is sitting just shy of that number because you have that 8-round magazine and one in the carrier, and then if you wanted, you could shove one in the chamber, although they did not. No. So tube magazines actually trended towards this number, but that's old tech. When you get into the center fire smokeless cartridges, especially trying to balance a magazine at the center point of the rifle, you run into a problem where every round you stack up puts another inch in this dimension, and then if you try to go prone and lay on the ground or post up on a wall or something, this gets in the way. And also, this is a piece that's sticking out that in action can be struck, dented, damaged. And it's got to be held onto the gun somehow, and you don't want... It's tricky. It's tricky to do a magazine system like this, and most people were afraid to have an overextended magazine, or they did not come around the idea of a double stack magazine. So in this particular gun, the reason you can get 10 rounds in the space that you could normally get 5 on, say, a Mannlicher, where you have the same sort of distension, is because it's double stacked. They're laying, sort of crisscross to each other down the stack. Now, of course, that opens its own problems because doing a double stack magazine with rimmed cartridges, which is a rim at the end of the base of the case, means that there's more opportunities for them to cross against each other and snag on the feed, and then you've got to dump the whole thing out and reload it so that you don't end up binding up the action. And a lot of people will say, over and over and over again to me, if you stack the clip the correct way, if you do this, hokey pokey, turn around, the gopher sees his shadow, it'll never happen. And yet I go to the range, and if I feed 30 mags, I'm guaranteed to find at least one rim lock on previous models. On the Mark III and Mark III Star, they put a lot of effort into shaping the magazine to get away from that problem. And so if you have a dirt common Mark III Star, you probably don't run into rim lock very often, but that's after 20 years of poking and prodding to get it just right in the production line.
Right. Huh. Oh, that's cool. All right, cool. So where are we next?
Well, here's the thing. Right before the war, Britain was just about fed up with this gun. It's hard for you to appreciate it when we look backwards and understand that this was used all the way through World War II. But the Lee-Enfield has some inherent problems that the British agreed with. Like I said, the receiver is not as strong as some others, although it certainly works for 303 within a reasonable lifespan of the gun. There were some problems with accuracy, although the problems with accuracy they were having was way, way out. You're talking about 1,000-yard shots. We're talking about, sniping essentially.
Right.
And they were trying to get the action bedded just right, and they were doing all this fiddling. At some point, these guns have very thin barrels at this point. They came out with a heavy barrel model as well, but compared to other guns, this is a fairly thin barrel. It uses a kind of a weird clamping system and, held at the nose cap to balance the barrel out. This is getting into the finer points that we don't need for this video, but basically, when you're pushing 1,000 yards, this starts to walk out a little bit more than some of the contemporaries like the Mauser. I know a lot of people are going to scream bloody murder about that, but it's true. It just, when you are trying to mass accurize, when you're trying to produce them on an assembly line and have them come out accurate, it takes more tweaking to get this system in line than it does, say, a Mauser system.
Okay.
So Britain was aware of this, and they, post-Boer War, they were obsessed with long-range accuracy out of sort of a short rifle-ish pattern close to this length. And they would start developing what would be the Pattern 13, which was an experimental gun that did not get into the war because the war broke out and interrupted that process. But that gun was supposed to use a smaller diameter, faster flying bullet in order to get a nice, flat, long-range shot. And they built the whole gun around heavy barrel, Mauser action, and then what's called sight radius, which is the distance between your front and rear sight, is very helpful to quickly and accurately assessing what you're shooting at. So the further apart these are, the more accurate your shot is, just based off the way the human brain registers that distance and sight radius. So on this gun, you can tell this rear sight's actually fairly far up the barrel, so it's not a strong position on the gun. They could even have walked it back here and gotten a little bit better out of it. Instead, they'd look at a totally new design. And that design, like I said, did not get done for the war, but they had built up all these plans for how to manufacture it. They had the understanding of what they needed to do. It was practically ready to roll. And then the war broke out, and they knew that they couldn't do it at home. But they needed weapons, and they were looking at the U.S., and they realized that it would be easier to get the U.S. to produce the new gun that was designed for modern manufacturing than it would be to try to train the U.S. how to assemble these things, because they're so finicky about how you have to make them that it would take 2 years to get the crew just right to make this gun. So give the new crew a new gun instead of trying to teach them the weird semi-old world craftsmanship of the Lee-Enfield.
Okay.
So that became the Pattern 14, because they took that experimental gun and they turned it into just a regular 303. And that's this guy. So just taking a broad look, very recognizable profile, but let's take a zoom in and we'll see some big improvements. So we have front locking lugs. It is still cock on close. They like that nice fast stroke. We still have the nice bent bolt handle that puts our finger down by the trigger. We have a rocker style safety, although it's better positioned by the thumb instead of across the back of the gun. This is interesting because, remember, this predates the war in design and then was initially rolled out right at the beginning of the war. So this still has the old long-range dial sights and flip-up aperture, because this is before they made the improved or simplified model of the Mark III Star. And then, if I flip it back, we have a aperture sight, which means a little hole that we look through, and the brain is very good at automatically centering that front sight post on the hole, so that makes it very rapid to acquire your picture, to acquire your target. The sight picture has a much longer sight radius, I mean, down the entire length of the gun practically. So very accurate in terms of the human element, and then also heavy barreled Mauser action, evenly locked at the front instead of the rear. This is a terrific sniping style rifle. And I just lost my cameras.
You lost your camera.
It's cool. You finished out the segments you needed to finish.
That
out.
cut right at the last second. It might have gotten a nip.
Do you want to record?
I thought it looked good.
Just give me a record.
Recording.
Give me the upper one. I'm just going to do a quick fixer indie in case we lost some footage.
Okay.
Recording again.
You got the other one recording? Top one? Because I'm going to have to do a walkout to the... It's not doing it. I think she overheated. Unable to start live. Yeah, it's overheated. All right, give her cool.
That one should be fun.
No, I can't do it on that one because that's the shot that would have been.
You need to pause?
Yeah, we'll have to take a moment. I just ran out of heat. It is scorching in here.
Okay. Well, we're taking a moment, guys. How are we doing on time?
I would turn on the air and crank it down to like 60 and see if we can get this under control in here.
Cool.
I am boiling alive a little bit.
Oh.
We'll put some questions in.
Yeah, you want to let's see a couple of questions so we can have them. I'll see what you got. Sure. What do you got, Flo?
I have two general ones. Maybe you can fit those in there.
Okay.
So, at the
These
bottom.
bottom. And did the British standardized arms across? Do you want to hear a couple questions, Othais?
Sure.
Somebody wrote, did the British standardize arms across all fronts, or did they have different arm sets for each individual front or colonial soldiers? Well, you've touched on that, but it'd be nice to do it as a general question. And this guy's general war question. Well,
I can answer some while we're waiting for the cooldown, but they won't be in the edited show, so you want to decide whether it's worth...
yeah, that's fine. Flo says that's fine.
Oh, okay. You want to edit? I can just answer it now live?
You can answer it now live, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. They did have standardized arms across all fronts. As a matter of fact, they took the effort to have even like the Ishapur arsenal convert a bunch of long rifles into the exact Mark III short rifle to the point that they replaced 90% of the parts on the gun. And so the idea was to really get things down as simple as possible, which is why you don't see Britain using as many obsolete pattern arms as the other nations. Like, people like to talk about the British and the Martini Henry, and we're going to talk about the Martini Henry in our show, but it was used as a balloon buster, and then it was sent out to the Middle East for rebels to use, and that was about it for British use of it, because they had done this huge effort to constantly upgrade and re-standardize all of their guns. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't have long rifles, because, like I said, these guys got converted to the same loading and ammunition pattern, but they also got new sights so that they were all set to that same Mark 7 ammo. So, you know, you're basically dealing with something that looks like this because all the long rifles trended towards this, or you're looking at something that is a lot like the Mark III because all the short rifles trended towards the Mark III. They did still have Mark 1s. They have what's called the Mark 1 star because it was done up 3 times over.
Yeah.
That still used a very unique clip loading system that was kind of frail. Those got issued to rear echelon troops just because it was ready, available, and in 303. But that's sort of it for the old stuff. Again, check our episode on the short magazine Lee-Enfield because we have the Mark 1 in there as well.
Was this one answered?
Okay. You want to hear another one?
Unique, eccentric.
Oh, no. You got another one?
Well, this is an interesting one. I mean, this is something I could address in an Out of the Trenches, too. A general war question. Was it common or rare that the Entente and Central Powers sold their weapons with or to each other?
Actually, fairly common, but in conservative numbers, depending on who they were supporting. We have an episode that's just about to drop about Romania and then later Greece in the war. And what you see especially is smaller powers or powers that are on the fence being bribed with this notion of, we're going to send X amount of equipment or rifles or ammo, and we'll keep you in the fight. And then it doesn't always come to fruition. Romania suffered from this pretty badly. So, like, the French were equipping the Romanians for the most part, but it was never really enough to displace their losses or equal out what they had already had in inventory at the beginning of the war.
Yeah.
So they did move stuff around, but mostly they ended up sitting on it for their own use. Like, the French weren't inclined to give up too many of their rifles because they needed them, even though they needed another front. And you're going to see this time and again. However, the exceptions to this would be Germany was fairly good about sharing arms with its allies and the Central Powers. And then the U.S. obviously was the manufacturer for most of the Entente for a good part of the war until the U.S.'s entry into the war, which actually, we'll talk about this more in the U.S. weapons episode, but because the U.S. was producing at high volume before the war, like every other country went into the war and then had to try to catch up production or buy new arms, the U.S. didn't have to buy a whole ton of arms and didn't have to gear up because other countries paid to gear them up. They were buying U.S. weapons, so all the U.S. manufacturers were already running at full production, and then it was just a matter of walking in and going, all right, you're making it for us now, let's go, and then boom, switch gears, and the output just goes somewhere else in a different cartridge, and boom, you've got revolvers, handguns, rifles, and they're just coming out at full blast. There's no workup time because we were already selling to everybody else to begin with.
Yeah. And we were talking before about the Romanians before the war, they were using the Steyr weapons. They were using the Austrian weapons, and suddenly they're enemies with Austria. And how do you get ammunition? And nice that the French wanted to help them a bit, but geez.
Oh, I did some digging on the Greek stuff. I managed to get a hold of some Greek sources, and just to recap something on that episode, there were absolutely nods, by the way, because the Greeks were debating between a German and an Austrian rifle. And the Austrians basically came out and said, we'd be a lot more inclined to agree with your issue on Macedonia if you were to buy a couple 100,000 rifles. And so that was a big political factor in why they chose a gun that was, I'm sorry, inferior to the competition at that time.
Okay. Huh. That's very interesting. Man,
all right, I probably have enough cooldown unless you need anything else.
No, that was what Flo had and stuff. It's funny because before I started doing this show, I knew a bit about Greece during the war and stuff, but we've noticed in the last like 2 years, we talk about Greece every week, basically. Something's happening in Greece that deals with the war. I had no idea that Greece was so important to the war, and so part of the effort before doing this show. So I think it's great that I get to learn stuff like that.
Yeah, Greece is one of those, and I mean, I could be talking out my keister, but so far what I've been seeing is that Greece was one of those sort of, it's in a weird area where it was not one of the what you think of as the first world power, but it still had a lot of nationalistic pride, and it didn't know which way it wanted to cut, and so it had all these associations with the Central Powers and all these associations with the Entente, and it became this sort of battleground of ideas. And so it seems like you see a lot of Greece acting as if you just watch Greece, you can sort of read the direction of the war at any given time.
That's actually quite clever. That's good to say. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we can work up our cameras now.
All right.
Yeah, I'm still recording. And then what I'm going to do, Indy, is it's going to be weird. It's going to be redundant, but I'm going to walk through a couple of the last features to make sure that if that got cut off, you have.
I got you. That's cool. That's cool. Okay. Well, no, we'll take it away. We're back.
Recording Brit rifle pickup at the P14.
Yep.
Recording Brit rifle pickup at the P14.
Okay.
It came out.
All right.
Okay, and I'm just going to have hand here and look up, and then hopefully that'll edit out. Now give me the main. Okay, because I'm just going to patch this, and then we'll walk it out. So.
Okay, and for anybody out there that wants to know more about Greece, you can watch our Greece special, which we already did, or especially you can go back to November, December, and January and watch the episodes that we just did when we're talking about Greece virtually every week in the regular Thursday episodes.
Okay, good.
All right, back to you.
But overall, again, this is a gun built to be heavy, long range, accurate, with a cartridge that it's no longer chambered in. So this is now set up for 303 British, which it still uses well. And as a matter of fact, these would be preferred by snipers and would be outfitted with, optics and things like that. You're going to see them even into World War II being favored as a good sniping platform. We're also going to see the U.S. adopt the same gun in 30-06, but we'll talk about that later. This is a terrifically accurate, rugged, war-ready rifle, but it's heavy and it's new, and it took until about 1917 for a significant number of them to show up. And so Britain would treat it as a second line or dedicated sniping rifle, and that was about it. So not a lot of these, despite 1.8 million being made, ended up on the front. Instead, they would replace practically everything else so that they could move Enfields to the front.
Oh, okay.
And of course, another problem is that when the British sent this gun over to be produced, they had it produced by 2 Remington factories and Winchester. You're going to see that they sent a slightly different pattern rifle to each. So they're like, build this gun. And then they gave them 3 slightly different guns. And so each manufacturer built a slightly different version of this gun, so the parts don't interchange. So you'd get them in, and then if you have a field armorer, he has to have 3 versions of every part if he wants to be able to just drop it in, or he's got to start hand fitting everything, which is another reason why they kept them off the front. And the U.S. manufacturers, of course, were scratching their head because they're like, we produced exactly what you said you wanted. It's just one of those things that it kind of walked away from them before they could get a hold of it.
Right.
And it also confuses collectors today who are trying to replace anything that might have broken.
But they didn't have problems with the ammunition between the 3 different models. Like you know, we've talked about the different Spanish factories that, you know, the ammunition from one wouldn't work on a gun.
Yeah, talking about the magazines. No, these guys, for the most part, there's little tweaks that they would do to the design here and there to get the best out of it. But out of the box, P14s ran. And again, we have a whole episode on these guys and the US 1917 if you're looking for more detail than this. But this is probably the best unused rifle in the British inventory, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. That's a great sentence too.
Yeah, it's the best. No, never made it to, I mean, maybe 1 or 2, but it's the best rifle to not sit on the front line. And yet, I have another one that is probably one of the worst rifles of the war that absolutely did make it to the front line because it was available in those early days. A lot of people probably recognize this, the Canadian Ross rifle. Now, this particular one took a bit to put together, so it's got a few dings and dangs, but she's up and running, and we definitely shot her and done an episode on this gun. This thing is infamous in terms of, basically people tend to think of it as a suicidal rifle just to use it, which is not an entirely unfair assumption, but I think people go a little too far criticizing this gun. The big thing about this is that it came about because Canada was having a hard time getting equipment from Britain during the Boer War, and then they wanted to set up their own domestic production of the short magazine Lee-Enfield, and Britain was not helping them with that. So they said, well, if you're not going to help us get set up making your rifle, we're going to make our own rifle, and it's going to be cooler, and we're going to kick your rifle's butt. And they brought in a mad Scot, essentially, turned Canadian. Charles Ross has a biography that everyone should read. The man is his own version of Teddy Roosevelt and Hemingway.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, Charles Ross basically takes the Austrian 1895 system and has been working on it for years already, and then Canada sort of goes, well, we could do something with your gun, and he turns it into a straight pull rifle for Canada, and that's like the Mark I, Mark II, and then there's all these problems with it. They finally get it just right, but at the same time, there's a lot of politics around why it doesn't work right, and so then they come out with the Mark III, which is this one in 1910. So this could be called the Model 10 or the Mark III. This is supposed to solve all the problems, and it's actually very different from the earlier Mark II, although it is still a straight pull rifle with the same sort of locking system. And a lot of this was pushed, by the way, by Sam Hughes. And so this gun is really tied to sort of the downfall of Sam Hughes in his political career for pushing sort of a favoritist industry that he was sort of tied to personally above the interests of the Canadian soldiers, because these things just weren't dialed in where they needed to be. And the biggest problem with the Ross isn't that it was unreliable or somehow inferior inherently. The problem was just refinement. Inspection was not good. Testing in rugged conditions was not good. They treated it like a big sporting rifle, and it's beautiful sporting rifle, but it's not a good military rifle until you make these X number of tweaks. To be fair, the Lee-Enfield was the same way. There's nothing about this gun that is so radically different from the earlier problems with the Lee-Enfield, except the Lee-Enfield received the attention it needed to get to be the final product. Right. So let's take a closer look and just see what the heck I'm talking about. So this is in 303, and it's a straight pull action. You just pull back on this guy, and the system automatically turns to unlock and then pulls out. Now, the big thing that a lot of people are familiar with this gun, and actually our friend Ian, who you know as well, Indy, has a video on this, is that if you assemble this sort of 180 degrees the wrong way, you can manage to shove this forward, and it will not actually turn into lock. So when you pull the trigger, the whole thing just blows out the back and into your face. So That would be fixed by setting a rivet into the action so that you could not assemble it backwards, which is great, but obviously that could have saved some people some eyesores or potential maiming or death if they had done it a little sooner. But as infamous as that is, that's not the big killer in World War I. The big killer in World War I is a combination of factors that took them so long to track down that by the time they nailed all the problems in this gun, everyone had given up on it. It was pulled from the front lines, and it was never deemed to be used again. The big problem is that the soldiers would use this gun. Here, let me back up for a second. They'd use this gun, and they'd boom, 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 and at some point she gets stuck, maybe 1, 2, 3 rounds in, and then the natural tendency, because it's a straight pull, is that if this bolt is stuck and you really can't get it with your hand, you just set it on the ground and just kick it open, because why not? It's a straight pull. It's got a nice flat surface here. The human tendency is going to be kick it hard, and that's going to open her up. Now, the reason it was tight to begin with was because British ammunition was of looser spec than the Canadian ammunition. And so they would get this sort of odd British ammo. They had a nice tight sporting style chamber, not a wide forgiving military chamber. This is a hyper accurate gun that needs the ammo to be just so. Well, that would cause it to sort of initially bind, and it just, you know, it'd swell up and get stuck. And that's not an inherently horrible problem. You just get to re-ream the chamber, and they would eventually do that. But when you go to solve that little problem by kicking it open, they have, here, let's zoom in. They have a serrated bolt head. So you have these interlocking locking lugs. So a lot like, it's an interrupted screw pattern, a lot like an artillery piece. So what this does is it provides more locking surface. So the surface area of the locking lugs is quadrupled, essentially. Well, I guess tripled from what it normally would be, which is just this back surface here. And it means that this is an extremely strong action. And actually, the concept does work. But these individual wings are easier to deform, and you see how they kind of come down to the root of the bolt. There's a bolt stop right here. So when we pull the gun and the bolt stops, it can't pull any further. That's this half circle of metal back in here. Well, if that half circle isn't deep enough to go deeper than the base of this rear left piece, the natural mechanical thing is that it's going to deform it if you hit it too hard. And that's exactly what happened. They made the stop too shallow, and so it was only like 2/3 the depth of this piece that it needed to be so that it would hit the root. And so when you kicked it open, so you have a minor ammo issue. Here, let me zoom out. You have a minor ammo issue. You kick it open to solve that issue, and when you do, you deform the bolt head, which also at the same time they were not properly heat treating the bolt heads. So it deforms that bolt head. And then you go to slam it shut again and fire it again. Well, yes, it's deformed just enough that you can close it, but then when you fire it deformed, you now have a stuck cartridge and a deformed bolt head. And every time you kick it open to solve it, you make the problem worse. So within 5-6 rounds, you've made the rifle practically inert. And so people just hated this gun. And then some guy standing next to you would have a properly heat-treated bolt head, or they weren't kicking their gun, or the chamber was a little... And he just didn't have the problem that you had, or maybe you were part of some division that was given Canadian ammo or something, and you didn't. And so it's this weird report of these guys are fine, these guys hate it. Nobody could figure out what was going on. It wasn't until the British ordered their own pile of these, the Mark III-B, which has a slightly different rear sight. The British ordered them, and they had to send over a British inspector because it was a British order, and he looked around and went, what the heck is going on? Why isn't this that? And so the British inspector sort of helped them sort out what was happening.
Right.
But by then, the Canadians were so fed up that they were just like, get rid of Sam Hughes, get rid of the rifle, give us Lee-Enfields, we're done with it. And so it's interesting, though, historically, we know all the changes they made, that was the last problem. Like, they got all the problems. We know of no other additional problems with this gun after that point, and in kind of reverse engineering these, we don't see any other problems with them.
Yeah.
And they're going strong for 100 years, but they solved the problem right before they pulled it off the line, because it's the third problem in a row they solved. They couldn't know that there was not a fourth problem. They just assumed there's going to be a fourth problem and a fifth problem. And so they just got them out of there.
This is my favorite part of this stream so far, this gun, actually. That was the most interesting for me. That was a fascinating story. That was great.
Yeah, the Rost rifle is just one of those things where you have 3 interlocking issues, and you have to untangle. Like, troubleshooting is great. You got to find, like, you got to reduce it to the one variable. but you have 3 variables that affected this gun, and so it made it very hard to discover what was happening. And this gun was an absolute favorite for snipers because they were given much better kind of match grade ammo. Like snipers were issued better ammo, so they never had the initial problem. So they would just fire their rifle and then they just work the bolt like a normal person, and they never developed the issues that the other people did. So they would just sit there and dump a ton of oil in it to make sure that it didn't lock up and feed it prime ammo. And they thought it was the best thing of the war because it was very, very accurate. It has an extremely heavy, long barrel. It's getting a lot of muzzle velocity. It's burning all that powder. It's got a flip-up rear aperture sight, or if it's flipped down, you've got a simple leaf battle sight, but it's at the rear of the receiver like that P14, so you have a very long sight radius. It is a beautiful sniping platform. It is a terrible infantry rifle up until those fixes were made.
Well, that's great. That's again, that was I like that part. Great. Thanks for that.
But I think that pretty much wraps us up for our rifles today. There's going to be some other stuff. The British were known to use the Arisakas, the Japanese Arisakas, for naval use, and they would have things like Chilean Mausers. They also bought a handful of commercial arms from the U.S., but these are all sort of small and away from the front and can be talked about in other episodes or just over at C&Rsenal.
Okay, and we're doing how we're on time. We're okay. And you got any questions or something, Flo? Flo's got a couple of questions if you want to take a couple.
Yeah, you want to gather and I'll run another cooldown for a second?
Sure, sounds good to me.
Okay.
Everything on the rifles.
Everything on rifles. Okay. Should I ask him now? Yeah. Or...
Yeah, you can ask, and then if we want to get it recorded, I'll just keep it here and we'll just go with it.
You know, I mean, we'll have plenty for us. We have plenty of recorded material anyway. So, you know, it's more for you if you want to use the questions or anything, but we're cool with it. Okay, here's some questions about Did the British ever consider using lever action rifles during the war? They seem they would be useful in Africa and other colonies.
Actually, the British purchased about 20,000 of them. The thing is that they used them for naval ships and dams and things like that. They were issued essentially as inspecting rifles. I don't know how to explain it. It's sort of like a boarding party rifle. They'd get Winchester 92s in, I believe, 44 Winchester, and they'd issue them to a lot of naval personnel who, not unlike the big ships, we're talking about the little guys that are going and inspecting incoming cargo and stuff like that. And when they went to go check a boat, if they needed to take a carbine with them, they'd have this handy little Winchester carbine. And so those actually did serve with the British. Now, British use of the 94 has been suggested to me, although I have not seen significant numbers or where they would have gone. But the French actually use the 94, which is something we're working on. So there are some other lever actions than just that Russian 1895 everybody's so familiar with. However, only the 1895 really made it to the front line.
Okay. How about this? Did British snipers use backward-seated bullets to take on enemy sniper positions, or is that just a myth?
Actually, the reversed bullet was the problem is this, everything's compartmentalized. So what I understand is that the Germans definitely spun their bullets backwards and tried it out in an attempt to blow out the rivets on armored positions or tanks. So the idea is that you would thump what you were hitting with a heavier charge and a reversed bullet, and then you could pop rivets and interrupt what they were doing, and therefore damage shields and tanks. Now, whether the British did it, I've heard the British have done it. Who did it first, I can't say, but the reverse bullet thing is actually something a lot of people tried. And it's one of those things that I feel like in the battlefield, people felt like it had a lot more success than it probably really did, because then you see things like the introduction of the K-bullet, and that's an actual solution to an armored problem. What the British really did, though, if you're curious about British bullet use, is they did a lot of experiments with, like, high velocity, large bore, they did a lot of, not high, I can't speak today. They did a lot of experiments with commercial heavy cartridges. So like what you think of like 500 Express or something like that. They take these big, like large game elephant killing cartridges, and they'd take sport rifles that could shoot them, and they'd walk them to the front and try popping German shields with them, and then report back on how that worked. Ultimately, they did not go with that. They just went with the sort of improved sort of armor-piercing 303 because that was easier to get out and did a reasonable job of what they were doing. And they also had other tactics to break up these defenses versus just trying to work in a whole new cartridge for one thing that you could do with a mortar. So they did have some experiment with their bullets, but ultimately they would walk everything back to the center line of what can we standardize and push out.
Can you do a favor for Great War Channel fans who might not know as much about weapons as your channel fans do? Can you explain to people what actually a reverse bullet is?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think if I have it. I don't know that I have a bullet laying around. Essentially, at that time, you have for most armies, you have a pointed Spitzer style bullet, and then what is more like a boat tail rear end. So it kind of, and I'm sorry I'm doing this with my hands, but it kind of comes to a flat at the bottom and a little bit of the rounded size, not nearly as sharp as the other point. The idea is that if you flip that around, you get a greater surface area, sort of a thumping round, and it transmits more of that initial force into the object. And so that's why the reverse bullet isn't so much about getting through an object as it is about shaking the crap out of an object so that it'll pop rivets or any sort of assembly. Like it's more about being able to put a hammer to it than it is about being able to punch right through.
And penetration. Okay, cool. Let's see. How about this one? I've read that the volley sights were used successfully during the movement phase of 1914. Is it true at all?
Let me get my cameras up for this while we're talking about it, because I might as well just go ahead and run them. Hold on.
Pardon?
I'm running my cameras up real quick.
No, I'm just asking Flo what he was saying. You were saying what?
The question referring to the
You good?
SMLE sites.
The SMLE sites. Okay.
That's what the question is.
You good? Okay, you ready for me, Andy?
Yeah, I'm ready for you. This is guys asking about the SMLE sites. I've read that the volley sites were used successfully during the movement phase of 1914. Is it true at all?
I actually was talking with our friend over at British Muzzleloaders just about 2 weeks ago about this, and it's tricky to answer that question because we have personal accounts of British infantry saying that they rather had mixed success with them, but then we don't have any real record of actual acknowledgement on a higher level that, yes, this is the strategy that won this little event. The truth be told, what you're creating when you use volley fire like that is the same thing as what you would get from a beaten zone from a machine gun, only inherently worse because you can't target the area as well. You have multiple men, and maybe with enough men you can equal the same rate of fire, but then you also have more dispersion, and it's all kind of a potluck anyway, and the guys are likely to wear out a lot faster than just sort of keeping one or two machine guns in play. And even beaten zones, while good at harassing an enemy, and by the way, this is the idea that you can, it's kind of like light artillery with bullets. You lob an indirect shot, so you can't even necessarily see what you're looking at. You just know where it is by range and position. Let's say that it's an intersection of two trenches that is commonly used to bring up food and supplies, and you know that the enemy's over there, and you don't have artillery to just sink on it. So instead, what you do is you go, well, we know where they're generally over there, and we can freak them out by landing bullets all around them. We're not necessarily going to kill a lot of people, but we are going to make that area inhospitable for them. This sort of strategy worked well against unorganized non-European troops for Britain before in sort of Middle Eastern areas, because they would mass their troops and then prepare for their battle, and then they'd go out. And so volley fire works well for that because you figure out where they're massing, and then before they can even see you, all of a sudden some of them are getting hit, and it's freaky, and it just panics, and it destroys morale, and yada, yada, yada. Using against Germans who know well enough to just take cover because they're modern fighters,
yeah,
probably not as effective as people like to make it out. And then another thing that gets talked about with the Lee-Enfield early in the war is that sort of being able to fire so rapid that everybody thought it was a machine gun. I've seen dozens of accounts of British saying the Germans thought we had machine guns, the Germans thought we had machine guns.
Yeah, the madmen. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is I've never seen a German account of them saying we thought they had machine guns. Like, they can't find the core. Lost you for a second. Oh, there.
But it's back. They can't. Okay, continue.
Yeah, so I can never seem to find the German side of that discussion. So it's one of those things that it may have a grain of truth. I need harder evidence. There's a lot of these stories that get. Britain's amazing at this. Britain repeats probably more inflated stories out of the war than any other nation, and I think a lot of it's just sort of the post-war pub culture or something, because these guys would sit and chat and just sort of work it up, and the stories got bigger and bigger. So trying to trace it all back to a point where you're trying to be more precise. It's not that we can't repeat the oral history. It's just that we also have to be a little bit skeptical of it before we think that that's just the way it worked.
Right. No, that's true. Yeah, we know, and we actually talked about that even in the first month of the war back in 2014. I got one last question for you from someone. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Hey, got another question. I don't know if we asked one of this guy's questions or not, but what is the most eccentric or unique weapons the British used in the First World War? And by that I mean, guns. I mean,
Right. Well, in terms of firearms, honestly, I love that horse artillery pistol, but that's really still fairly standard for the war. I'd say the most interesting is the fact that they dredged up break action shotguns and Martini breech loaders in order to fire incendiary rounds at balloons. I mean, it's hard to beat that you dredge up this black powder or commercial shotgun technology, because you have to get a big enough bullet to light something on fire so that you can shoot the balloons that the other guy's throwing at you. And then the other thing is they did that, and it's not like you could stand on the ground and just shoot the balloon. They're up there pretty high. So they would have to do things like mount they literally would mount a break open shotgun with 2 rounds in it and a link trigger so that you could fly an airplane near enough, because the airplane still couldn't reach the ceiling height, and then try to just bump up and get 2 rounds off on the balloon. Obviously, this does not work well, and that this would get traded out for other technologies, but it's just fascinating that this is the sort of things that you're trying to do to just keep these balloons from coming over.
And I'll add an addendum to that doesn't actually have to do with firearms. Of course, I as Flo and them know, one of my favorite stories of the British war effort was during the first part of the Battle of the Somme, when the Indian cavalry went into action with lances and actually impaled 16 German soldiers on lances. They didn't even bring their guns. They didn't do so well in terms of them surviving the battle, but I can just imagine the surprise and terror on the Germans' faces when a bunch of Indians turned up with lances and came over the top. That's how weird this war was, I guess that's it. I guess that's it for our stuff. Yeah, that's about an hour and a half. Okay, well, everybody, I would like to. Oh, here's your computer, Flo. I'd like to give big thanks to Othais and May, of course. Once again, it's great to just sit here and listen to you and occasionally interject. And I urge every one of our fans to please check out C&Rsenal, his channel. Again, the link is below. And we'll do more of these in the future, every couple of months, until the end of time. Othais, would you like to say goodbye to everybody?
Before I say goodbye, just because this is going to be out there, if you have some question or comment still sitting out there, especially about the firearms, by all means, comment and engage and like, and give the Great War what they need for this video to succeed. But if you're expecting Indy to respond, or for me to be able to keep up 2 months from now with manually checking these back, it won't ding me when you comment on this video. So if you have a question for me, you're going to have to come over to C&Rsenal or email us or something like that. But I am happy to answer questions. So just make sure you put it in the appropriate spot, because I've definitely found comments months later, and I feel bad because I think they expected me to know that those comments were there 3 months down the line.
Well, I know exactly how that is. And absolutely, everybody, if you have specific questions about the weapons, they are questions for Othais and not for me and Flo. Okay, well, if you have not already subscribed to our channel, then you should be doing that right away. But I guess you are. Otherwise, you wouldn't be watching this live stream. And now, Flo and I are going to go get pizza and drink wine. And we're going to leave Othais because it's daytime there. Well, okay, thanks a lot, man. It was really nice talking to you again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And then, by the way, one addition from C&Rsenal, there's a smaller channel out there that we have been working with on occasion. If you care about British equipment, if you came to this video because you saw the word British, then you need to look for British muzzle loaders. Rob does an excellent job of really getting into the nitty-gritty of British Empire arms. But otherwise, World War I, I'm your guy, C&Rsenal. Just look down below for how to spell it, because there's no way I'm going to do that out loud and you're going to remember it. But thanks a lot, and have a good one.
Okay, well, we'll see you next time. All right. Bye, everybody.